On Easter Monday 1916, the 5th Fingal Battalion of the Dublin Brigade of Irish Volunteers set out across the fields of North County Dublin, determined to play their part in the rising. Yet their bravery and sacrifice for Ireland is often neglected by the history books. Their actions during Easter week culminates in the only successful engagement during those fateful 6 days in April 1916. In the early part of the 20th century, North County Dublin was still very much a rural area. Its green fields and lush vegetation set Fingal apart from much of the rest of the county, and there was a strong local identity among Fingalians. The Gaelic revival was in full swing across Ireland, and the Fingal area was no different. The people of North County Dublin were being swept along by the rise of cultural nationalism, which reinforced the idea that the Irish identity was very different to that of the rest of Britain, and as such, we should also have a separate political system.
Well, Fingal's unusual in this period, possibly in the 25 years up to the Rising, so from the 1890s on, in that Fingal is far enough away from Dublin to be rural and reflective of the rest of the country, but close enough to Dublin to be directly influenced by what is going on there in various movements at the time. Within the Gaelic revival, you have a searching for an identity and an awareness that is not British. That's manifested in the language, it's manifested through the GAA in games, but also a very, very strong Irish Ireland movement in terms of buying Irish, in terms of being self-sufficient. And it's a number of these strands coming together that is the cumulative effect for what eventually becomes a focus under Sinn Féin in 1906.
Among the leading lights of the nationalist movement in early 20th century Fingal, IRB head centre for swords, Frank Lawless, played a key role in nurturing the Irish volunteers in the area. Alongside his brother James and son Joseph, he would go on to have a major impact with the Fingal Volunteers during the 1916 Rising.
The Lawless family are really central to the whole history of the 5th Battalion. They bring with them into a sort of a cellular structure all the other people, pretty much through cultural nationalism, which would be how the kind of Republican influence, as we now see it, was brought out into Fingal.
Frank had been involved with the United Irish League when the Swords Branch was founded in 1900. He was involved with the North County Dublin Farmers Association. But over the years, he became more and more disillusioned with the lack of progress in constitutional nationalism. In fact, at a meeting in 1906, which is reported in the Drogheda Independent, Frank is quoted as saying that every year since the death of Parnell in 1891, it has been a year further away from his faith in constitutional nationalism being able to deliver what Ireland needed.
In 1909, Thomas Ashe, a school teacher from Kerry, relocated to Fingal and took up a position as headmaster in Corduff National School in Lusk. Ashe, a prominent member of the IRB and Gaelic League, would become instrumental to the nationalist movement in the area, setting up the Black Raven Pipe Band and eventually taking over command of the Fingal Volunteers.
He is tied into the zeitgeist of the Republican movement in sort of cultural terms and in physical force terms. And he's even keyed into the concepts of socialism at the time. He's a wonderful character. He links into organising labour in farms in North County Dublin. That brings him into conflict with Kettle and various sort of more conservative nationalists.
Ashe very, very quickly becomes acquainted with Frank Lawless, and the two of them go about reorganising the IRB in the Fingal area.
I attended the first meeting of the Irish Volunteers at the Rotunda Rink in November 1913. Within a few weeks, companies of volunteers formed in Swords, Lusk and St Margaret's, showing that Fingalians were alive to the national situation. This nucleus then joined the city units at Hout on the 26th of July 1914. when the Asgard brought the first cargo of arms to the hands of volunteers.
The Fingal Brigade were left to guard the harbour. They were told to guard the harbour, not let any RAC men or anybody else in while the guns were being divided up. But when they were relieved, they ran towards their Asgard to get some guns. There was only one gun left. Benny McAllister got that gun. He jumped into the boat, got the gun, and some couple of rounds of ammunition. That was all that was left. So they had to then try and buy guns somewhere else.
A month after the Hut gun running, in August 1914, the declaration of war between Britain and Germany caused a great deal of excitement in volunteer circles. Now we thought our chance had come. A war in Europe would so distract the forces of the enemy that surely this was a chance to strike for our freedom. In Fingal, such talk was on every lip.
The outbreak of war was to have a huge impact for the volunteers in the Fingal area, but not in the way that Joseph Lawless was hoping for. Irish parliamentary leader John Redmond, himself a member of the Irish Volunteers and one of the leading figures in the Home Rule movement, felt that the fledgling organisation should enlist with the British Army to fight the threat of the Kaiser. This caused a split in the volunteer leadership, which in turn would have major implications for companies throughout Ireland, and Fingal was no different.
The splits following Redmond's speech in September 1914 in Wooden Bridge manifest themselves in various ways, and a little tragically in relation to certain families. Bernard McAllister has referenced in a witness statement that on hearing of the split, he and his brother went back to the father's house. Christopher McAllister was also an officer in the Irish Volunteers, and they took the guns that were stored there, knowing that their father would come down on the Redmond side.
He was a farmer, and of course he was making good money out of the First World War. Like, there was food wanted on the continent, and there was a big demand for food. Prices rose up, and I thought that, well, okay, this is putting money in my pocket, and I think that's how he changed. But the rest of the family know, and when they came evident to Benny and the rest of the family that he was turning towards the Redmondite viewpoint, they got up in the middle of the night, took all the arms and ammunition that they had and explosives and shipped it all over to the Torvey farm so that he wouldn't spill the beans on it.
At this period, the Fingal Volunteers were reorganised as the 5th Battalion of the Dublin Brigade. Now, this designation did not, of course, mean that our numbers amounted to battalion strength any more than elsewhere in the country. The 4 companies of the battalion were centred in Swords, Lusk, St Margaret's and Skerries. Each had an average of 20 to 30 men. Dick Coleman was the company commander at Swords. Jim Lawless, my uncle, commanded St Margaret's, while Ned Rooney was at Lusk. Skerries, the smallest of the 4 companies, was the responsibility of Joe Thornton and Jim McGuinness. Dr. Dick Hayes, Thomas Ashe and my father constituted the battalion staff.
In the months prior to the rising, the Fingal Battalion's training increased dramatically, with frequent rifle practice, drill exercises and manoeuvres, as well as receiving a number of tactical lectures from prominent members of the volunteer executive. There was a strong feeling among the companies of North County Dublin that an armed insurrection was imminent, and it was to come sooner than many of them expected.
In Fingal on Easter Sunday, as throughout the rest of Ireland, the volunteers mobilise. Many of them think that they're taking part in a normal exercise which has been going on throughout the country. Others know that there's going to be a rising taking place. They mobilise at Rathbeal. There's almost a 100% turnout. In the region of 120 men assemble. They form up at Rathbeal, and then the news is received that there's actually been a cancellation order published in the Irish Independent, and that causes consternation throughout the country.
What's McNeil doing with this countermanding order?
I don't know, sir. But the men know that something is up.
Yeah, well, we need answers soon, Frank. Get Joseph over there, see if you can get them for us.
Joseph!
Joseph, I need you to go into Liberty Hall. Find Commandant Connolly and see if you have any orders for us, okay?
Of course, sir. I'll leave right away.
Yeah, come here, take my motorbike, and this is very, very important now, Joseph, okay? So you be careful in there. If you get stopped by the authorities, use your utmost discretion, okay?
You can count on me.
All right, you'll hurry back once you have those orders.
Sir.
Good lad.
Joseph gets on the motorcycle, rides into Dublin, and describes it as eerily quiet as he goes up towards Liberty Hall. In Liberty Hall, he's well received, he's taken in, and he meets James Connolly. Connolly gives him the news that pretty much everyone within the Fingal Battalion doesn't want to hear, that it's off. He gets on the motorcycle and, disappointed, he returns to Saucerstown.
I spoke with Commandant Connolly. He asked me to give this to you.
What's the mood like in the city?
It's very tense in there, sir. Liberty Hall is awash with citizen army and a fierce amount of activity going on.
After receiving Connolly's order, the Fingal Volunteers were eventually stood down and returned to their homes for the night. Having realised that something serious was afoot, many of the rank and file of the battalion were disappointed with the news that all was off for the moment. However, the time for action was to be close at hand. Early on Easter Monday morning, Frank Lawless's sister Mary arrived at his farmhouse with a message from the GPO.
The following morning, I was awakened at about 7 o'clock by a violent knocking on the front door. Listening to the excited voices in the hall below, I recognised my Aunt Mary's. I knew something serious had happened for her to be here at this hour.
Frank, it's happening. Today. Get your men ready.
Then my father came into my room holding a piece of paper. His eyes were alight with excitement. Pierce's handwriting was unmistakable. The message simply read, "Strike at 1 o'clock today."
The process of remobilisation starts on Monday morning. Only 60 men assemble at Knocksadan. Some of the men have got up. The attraction of Fairy House is there and they've gone to do that. Others are still asleep in their beds. But the senior officers are assembled and they make their way to Knocksadan for the second mobilisation of the day. While they're assembling at Knocksadan, the pre-planning which had gone on before the rising begins to come into its own. And it's here that we see one of the essential differences in 1916 for the 5th Battalion, and that is the attacks on communications, mainly upon the railways, but also upon telex and telephone communications.
As the main body of the battalion moved out towards their first camp near Finglas village, Joseph Lawless set out on Ashe's motorcycle to meet up with the demolition squad from the Lusk Company.
Before leaving Knocksadan, Ashe instructed me to meet with Charlie Weston and the Lusk Company near Balroddery Avenue. Our orders were to destroy the Great Northern Railway crossing the estuary at Rogerstown. On reaching the bridge itself, I saw with dismay that the task was, for all practical purposes, beyond our resources. However, we laid gel ignite as best we could, stood back and set it off. A tremendous explosion then shook the embankment, sending railways, sleepers, and all kinds of debris hurtling towards me. While the bridge itself remained standing, we'd done enough damage to put it out of action for a time.
The battalion initially were instructed to prevent reinforcements moving into Dublin City, particularly the large number of British troops and RIC who would have been at the Fairy House races. So they move in to North Dublin and they establish a position near the Golf Links at Finglas Glen, and they can hear firing from Dublin. So they now know that they're involved in a major war and they're into the serious business of fighting for national liberation.
It seems strange to reflect on the queer unreality of the situation. We were now at war. Our comrades in the city had been fired at and were suffering casualties, but here in the fields, almost within rifle shot of it all, we calmly sat waiting for breakfast while the men laughed and joked with one another. We'd left our homes, possibly forever, to take part in the fight, but here we were, just waiting for something to happen.
While they were encamped at Finglas Glen, the 5th Battalion received a major boost to their ranks when First Lieutenant Richard Mulcahy arrived in the camp, having been cut off from his own battalion in Dublin City.
It was arranged that I would take charge of cutting the telegraph lines in Raheny, which would isolate Dublin from Belfast and from the cross-channel cable hut in Howth. On the way back into town, we encountered large numbers of Crown forces and were cut off near Phibsborough. It was only by a stroke of luck that we met up with the Fingal Volunteers.
Restart? Am I glad to see you, boy?
Good to see you too,
Ash was very glad to make contact with us and said he wanted me to join their ranks. He had about 80 men with him at this stage. We waited there for some time, then Ash apparently got orders that he was to send a detachment into Blanchardstown.
Both men know each other. They're very familiar with each other through the IRB and through the Gaelic League. And I would imagine for Thomas Ashe, meeting Richard Mulcahy at that stage is a godsend. Ashe knows that Mulcahy is the nearest thing that he's going to have in Easter week to a professional soldier.
Throughout the rising, the lines of communication between the 5th Battalion and the volunteer headquarters were kept open by members of the Fingal Cumann groups. Dispatch rider and scout, Molly Adrian, was one of the women who made the treacherous commute in and out of Dublin City.
Throughout Easter week, I acted as a scout for Thomas Ashe and delivered dispatches between the post office and the Fingal Battalion. Early on Tuesday morning, Ashe sent me into the volunteer headquarters in the post office to deliver a report on the camp's positions, numbers and armaments. Later that evening, I arrived back at the camp with instructions from Connolly.
What's the mood like in the city?
Commandant Ashe, the situation in Dublin is heating up. McNeill's countermanding has had the same effect on the city garrisons as it did with our own lads. Turnout isn't great at all.
Any orders from Connolly's for us?
He's instructed you to send 40 men into the GPO to reinforce the city garrison, sir.
40 men?
Ashe was none too pleased with this order, as you can imagine, but decided he could afford to let 20 men go.
Will you look after yourself, okay? Get yourself some food and rest. You'll be needed again soon.
Will do, sir.
Well, Ashe knows that if he sends 40 men into Dublin, he'll effectively have disbanded the 5th Battalion, turned it into an ineffective force. So after much soul-searching and discussion, he sends 20 men into Dublin, and he sends them in under the command of Richard Coleman.
My father was James Marks, and he was picked out to go into Dublin. When they got to the GPO, Connolly asked 4 or 5 of them to go to the Mendicity Institute on the Quays, where the leader there was Sean Euston, and there was very heavy firing on them. And he's supposed to have said to them, do your best to get there, boys. You mightn't get there, but do your best to get there. But they did. They walked they walked down the Quays, and I don't know how they sneaked over Cable Street Bridge and in the back. And then they were held up there that was on a Tuesday until the Wednesday, and then they were being bombarded from all directions.
And we're not fully sure why the Mendicity Institute is taken over, but we expect it was a last-minute decision, taken more than likely by James Connolly, to stop British troops coming from the Royal Barracks, or as it is now, Collins Barracks, and in particular from the train station. Arrival of the Fingal group sent directly by Connolly. They do halt the British Army for 2.5 days. The Royal Dublin Fusiliers are the unit that are based in the Royal Barracks. They get ambushed and they lose 4 or 5 people. And they do delay the arrival of reinforcements. But by Wednesday, the Irish Volunteers throughout the whole city are outnumbered by a huge scale.
Per Cody Wilson was one of the men that was picked to go in, but he never made it back to his family. He was killed fighting at the Mendicity Institute and is buried at Stephen's Hospital.
With Connolly's request to send reinforcements into the city, came instructions for the Fingal Brigade to cause as much disruption as possible in North County Dublin. With the order fresh in their minds, the 5th Battalion moved out from the Finglas camp and headed for Killeek. With the clear sound of gunfire emanating from Dublin City, Ashe held an officers' briefing to discuss their next move.
At Knocksedan, we assembled in a small farmhouse. Before going to bed that night, we went over the situation, and I was more or less accepted by Ashe as his principal lieutenant.
I think with the loss of the men to the city garrisons that we should divide the battalion into smaller groups.
We divided the force we had up into 4 companies.
And I want a junior officer in charge of each. That way they can work as a separate entity.
It'll certainly work in our favour, Tomas. The men will need to make their toes mind. I think we've got a busy few days ahead of us. Where do you propose we move to tomorrow?
Tomorrow, first thing, we're going to take the barracks in Swords Village and then on to Donabate.
Very well, sir. I'll make the necessary arrangements to move out in the morning.
After Swords, the 1st Battalion move on to what will really be their first taste of combat.
By the time we got down to Donabate, the police had been alerted and were in a defensive mood. Ashe and I and a few of the men moved in. The barracks was set back from the road. As we moved towards it, just before we reached the cover of the barracks wall, fire opened out from the building.
Inside, in the rather claustrophobic confines of the barracks, the men are ready to fight. They're manning the loopholes, and an exchange of shots takes place for about 15 minutes.
One of our lads who was in alongside the barracks wall had a homemade grenade made from a Fry's cocoa tin filled with gelignite.
Ready? Take cover! Back down!
He lit it and threw it into the fanlight of the door. It exploded inside and made such a noise that they made up their minds they were going to surrender. Donabate Barracks surrendered. It was dismantled and disarmed.
Moving through North County Dublin is quite difficult for the battalion at this stage. After the attack on Donabate, they decide to move over and attack the RIC barracks at Garristown. The barracks, they discover, is manned by only one man, and the arms that they'd hoped to capture have actually been withdrawn by the head constable to Balbriggan. So it's a hollow victory. They capture the barracks, they put the tricolour up, and Mulcahy goes in, seizes money and postage stamps and issues a receipt for it.
Later that morning, at their new billets near Baldwinstown, Richard Mulcahy was confronted by a number of men who complained that the rest of the country had not risen in rebellion and that the volunteer executive had not approved the rising. Eager to maintain the morale of the battalion, Ashe and Mulcahy addressed the men.
Thomas, we need to do something about this now before we lose the morale of the whole battalion. There's only a handful of them now, but discontent will grow if we don't do something.
On Thursday morning, two fellows from the St. Margaret's side started to kick up a stink, saying what we were doing was wrong, that we should give up this thing that McNeil had said so-and-so. The result being that the force had to be paraded. Nash and I spoke to the men.
You've done yourselves proud so far this week. I know a few of you are disappointed with the situation in the rest of the country, but we have to do our duty for Ireland.
Look, lads, I know there might be some doubts in this camp, but I urge you to reconsider. The Fingal Volunteers are a fine example of what can be done when a small but disciplined force strikes a blow for their country. I don't want you to leave. We don't. Your country needs you. But if you want to leave, then leave you must.
Sorry, lads, but this isn't right. So, are the rest of you with us till the end?
Every single one of them, bar the two lads who kicked up the fuss, decided they're going to stand by Ashe.
There was a level of surprise amongst Thomas Ashe and his officers that up until that point, there had been no real attempt by the enemy to engage with the 5th Battalion. However, that was about to change.
For a long time, the RIC have been the forgotten element in the whole history, not only of 1916, but especially of the Fingal Battalion and of the events of Easter week. It's impossible to have a war without having two sides, and the other side of that war in North County Dublin and in Meath is the RIC.
But at this stage, the RIC in 1916 the morale is very, very poor. They're not a happy organisation. They haven't had a lot of recruits in. They've lost a lot of men who've been encouraged to join up into World War I, into Irish regiments, in particular into the Irish Guards. It's not really the same organisation that had successfully put down other rebellions, and it's not at top of its game. And many of the men inside the RIC were looking for a quiet life. So when the rising does break out, it comes as a surprise to the men who are in the stations, but in particular to their commanders and to their intelligence units who really have missed any signs that there was going to be a rebellion.
Throughout Easter week, Alexander Baby Gray, the RIC's county inspector for Meath, had been receiving regular updates about the Fingal Battalion's movements. Hearing that 3 barracks in North County Dublin had been attacked in as many days, Gray felt that the barracks in County Meath were under threat, and he began making preparations for what he felt would be an inevitable attack.
Any update on the movement of the Sinn Féiners?
Well, since the rebellion began, the volunteers in Fingal have attacked Swords, Donabate, and yesterday Garrettstown Barracks near the county line. It's only a matter of time before they hit one of ours here in Meath, sir. Constable O'Connell, any news on the rebels' position?
Nothing yet, sir. Constable Bratton has been out scouting the area. He should be back soon with an update.
Very good, Constable. How are you getting on with the motorised force?
Nearly there, sir. We managed to commandeer a good number of vehicles from the local landlords. Some of them are providing civilian drivers. We mobilised at Slane Castle on the afternoon of Tuesday the 25th of April. And that night, strong sentries were kept on in anticipation of the rebels marching on Slane. And Constable Bratton of Navan, he did a lot of scouting for us on his bike.
Any news, Constable Bratton?
Some of the locals in the area believe the rebels are camped near Ashbourne, but nothing solid yet, sir.
Well, keep your ear to the ground.
Of course, sir. I've asked the locals to be vigilant and report any sign of rebel activity as soon as possible.
Good work, Constable. We need to keep on top of this and act swiftly if needs be.
While the RIC's quick reaction force was preparing for what they felt would be an inevitable attack on one of their barracks, Ashe and his senior officers reflected on the events of the previous days and discussed their next move.
The men have done themselves proud this week, but I suspect tomorrow's going to be more difficult. We'll set out to destroy the railway bridge here at Bannerstown. If we do that, we'll disrupt the Crown forces into the city and giving our lads some valuable time.
Sir, the Tommies will be out in numbers near the railway, which means our lads will be against a much stronger force. Do you think they'll be ready for it?
I certainly hope so, Richard.
At Baldwinstown, the decision to attack the Midland and Great Western Railway is taken. This is to interdict trains that are, they think, bringing artillery into Dublin. To do that, they're going to have to move near Ashbourne, where they know there is a substantial RIC barracks.
When I came along in front of Ashbourne barracks, I got the men into position and I went round the back and told Joe Lawless' section to come round and surround the building.
In the name of the Irish Republic, I command you surrender this barracks.
Ash was out on the road shouting at the police to surrender when the firing started. The bullets from the barracks were coming so close to me, they made an explosive sound as I passed my head, so I decided to find a safer position after that.
Word of the attack on the barracks in Ashbourne had now reached RIC County Inspector Alexander Gray, and his quick reaction force were preparing to move out from Slane Castle to confront the Fingal Volunteers.
I think it was in the afternoon we left Slane en route for Ashbourne.
You'll be all right, William. Yes, sir.
The county inspector was in the first car. I was with the district inspector and Constable O'Connell in the last car of the convoy.
The struggle for the barracks had gone on from 11:30 until 12 o'clock, when a canister grenade was thrown at the building.
Potter! Do you still have that canister bomb you got from Fitzborough? I want you to throw it at the front door of that barracks. We're going to shock them into giving up. Over it.
While it did no real damage to the barracks itself, it must have frightened the lads inside enough for them to consider their position. It was a kind of gesture they were going to surrender, and a few of our lads had went in. Instantly, shots rang out from Rath Crossroads. I looked up the road, and car after car after car seemed to be lined up. There was nothing to do but shout the cross, and half a dozen of our lads ran towards the crossroads as the RIC pulled up. They got behind the cars and into ditches, fixed themselves in that position, and were well covered by fire from the corner there.
Initially, Ashe and Hayes favour withdrawal. However, Mulcahy realises that if he tries to move back in the face of a superior and unknown force, they'll be caught and overcome. He decides at this point that he's going to dictate the fight will take place at the Rath Crossroads.
Though we were surprised by their unexpected arrival, the police were just as surprised by our presence there. Now we had a fair idea of their position and strength, whereas they were quite in the dark concerning our position and numbers. Mulcahy seems to have been the first person to grasp this fact, and his plan of attack was to make full use of the morale factor by creating the impression of a superior force. While he took half my men to support the main attack at the crossroads, I and the rest of my men were conducted by Ashe to take a position to the rear of the police on the main road.
Numerically, the men from the 5th Battalion should have run at that stage. But it's quite clear that they decided to stand and fight. They used the hedgerows, they used the local surroundings very, very well to defend themselves. And there's a lack of command and control on the other side, which is unusual because you have professionals on the other side. But these men are policemen. And they're not tacticians in war. A lot of the officers would have been ex-military, but they wouldn't have been the greatest technicians. And they're nervous, and they're unsure of how to go forward, and they don't want to get killed.
In this early time, Mulcahy has decided, and he said it to men as he's moving forward, that no matter how many RIC there are, he can give them a dog's death. So he's decided that today he's going to beat a superior force of RIC at the Battle of Ashbourne.
I left one of the lads at the back of the barracks and took the others down to the corner. At this stage, each corner of the crossroads was being held by 6 of our men and more around the back of the barracks.
We immediately left the cars, Mr. Smith and I getting on the fence facing the Garristown Road, and 2 shots rang out from the rebels. The officer directed me to fire back. I did so, and immediately a bullet flew past my face, and in rapid succession, roughly about 7 more buried themselves in the fence between Mr. Smith and I. I said to Mr. Smith, "I'm afraid we're surrounded, sir," to which he agreed.
In the meantime, a very considerable amount of destructive firing was kept up at the crossroads by our fellows. The situation was such that if a policeman was shot once, he was shot 3 or 4 times, because all our fellows could see from behind their cover was a black uniform, and they'd no idea if he was dead or alive, so you had a lot of damage done like that. Ultimately, our lads were at the end of the last car, so that they were held at the cross, held at the flank, and held at the rear.
While the Fingal Volunteers still held the upper hand in the fight at the Rath Crossroads, many of the men were rapidly running out of ammunition. Assessing the situation, Richard Mulcahy felt that in order to keep up the appearance of a stronger force in the eyes of the enemy, the 5th Battalion were badly in need of reinforcements. He immediately dispatched a scout to camp and called upon Frank Lawless's 4th Section to enter the battle. While the arrival of the 4th Section proved to be a decisive move by Mulcahy, the addition of the new volunteers was not without its complications.
Suddenly, the man who I had put to watch the rear called out that men were advancing on us from behind and were almost upon us. I peered through the edge of the bank to see the flesh colour of faces through the bushes, of men creeping rapidly and purposely towards us.
Misinterpreting the arrival of his father's section as RIC reinforcements, Joseph Lawless mistakenly fired on his own men and only narrowly avoided hitting his father. With his ammunition expended, Lawless accompanied Section 3 Commander Ned Rooney to Dr. Hayes' medical station.
The Battle of Ashbourne is a very fluid engagement. Throughout the 5 hours that it takes place, there's a lot of movement on the part of the Irish Volunteers. Men and sections are coming and going, and when Mulcahy calls for reinforcements, they're misinterpreted as being a breakthrough on the part of the RIC. At the aid station, Hayes and Ashe, who don't have as tight a tactical overview of what's happening, believe that this is possibly the end.
Joe, where's Mulcahy?
I haven't seen him, sir. Is everything okay?
No. The lads are being overrun up there. We're out of ammo. I'm going to have to call a retreat.
Yes, sir.
Ash proceeded towards the crossroads to order the retreat and was in the process of carrying out the order when Mulcahy arrived on the scene.
Has anyone seen Thomas?
Yes, sir. He's just gone to order a retreat.
Jesus, we have them on the ropes!
Being told by Dr. Hayes what was afoot, he then informed us, to our great surprise and my considerable discomfort, that the force we had thought to be enemy reinforcements were in fact our 4th Section, with my father, who'd come up from the camp at Barnestown and whose face in the bushes I'd fired at.
I told Ash what the situation was, and it was a great surprise to him. It was imperative that we retract the order to retreat before the RSC were any the wiser in order to get our men back into position.
Look, if we run now, right, they'll hunt us down those cars. We have to stand and fight.
I said to Ash, you can either drive the enemy up the road to us, or we'll drive them down to you, because the whole trend of the battle was going in that direction. He said you better drive them down the road to me.
With County Inspector Gray out of action, having been wounded in the first exchange of gunfire at the Rath Crossroads, command of the RIC forces fell to District Inspector Harry Smith. Smith desperately tried to coordinate a defence and made several attempts to break out from their vulnerable position. Leading by example, Smith tried in vain to rally his men for the fight. but most of them could not see the rebels and tended to fire without aiming.
At this stage, there was systematic fire on both sides of the road, and fire was having its effect. Fellows were getting injured, and some of them around us were moaning heavily. It was impossible to stick it. Mr. Smith came rushing by me, firing repeatedly into the field with his revolver. I shouted at him, "For God's sake, man, don't leave yourself so exposed." He got over the fence and fought from the drain for a time. And he fought openly from here for a considerable time, and the poor fellow was hit in the last 5 minutes of this unfortunate occurrence by an explosive bullet on the top of the head. I almost broke down when I saw him. And his words from the night before when we were together at Slane came into my mind. I would much prefer, O'Connell, to be killed by a German bullet than by one from these fellows. It was wretched. Poor Mr. Smith was dead, and he'd come out with us that same morning so full of life and vigour.
I came back across the fields where we were and found that the district inspector had been killed. Probing around on their side of the road, Frank Lawless and Jack Crinigan had flanked round the rear of the police. The DI at the tail end saw them. He killed Crinigan with a shot, and Frank Lawless, with a shotgun, killed him in return.
The gruesome death of District Inspector Harry Smith brought with it a realisation from the remaining RIC constables that they now badly lacked a strong leader. Sensing weakness in their enemy, a section of 9 volunteers, led by Richard Mulcahy, mounted a bayonet charge at the remaining RIC force. The constabulary's defence began to collapse, and it was not long before the men began to surrender.
On the road, the ordinary constabulary have been pinned down for 5 hours, taking fire from all directions. Their officers are gone and their cohesion is lost. They're now looking for a way to exit this fight, either through surrender or through victory, but it's becoming more and more apparent to the men on the road that the cause is lost. It's at this point that the spirit of the RIC is crushed. It's at this point that they decide this is the time to surrender. The battle cannot be won, and the Battle of Ashbourne is over.
After the battle, I met with my father on the main road, and he told me that poor Jack Crinigan had been killed. Crinigan was employed in our farm for a number of years, and he and I attended school together. Father and I felt his death as that of one of our own family.
When I arrived back at the scene of the fighting, the first thing I noticed was the DI's whistle on the road. I knew then that all was up with him.
I potted a young fella, about 70 yards behind the road fence. I found his dead body there when it was all over. His brother, a rebel also, was crying over him.
When all was over, we made our way down to the battlefield. After 5 hours of intense fighting, the scene that greeted us was utter devastation. We did our best to tend to the men, but wasn't an easy task. I, in fact, tended to the wounded of men on both sides, friend and enemy.
After 5 hours of fierce combat, a great deal of humanity is shown at the end of the Battle of Ashbourne, in particular by Thomas Ashe, who is very magnanimous to the RIC who've now surrendered to him. He treats them with all the military courtesy that they're entitled to, and he treats them like prisoners of war, which is something that was actually denied to the 5th Battalion and to the Fingal Volunteers after the Rising. They were very much treated as common criminals. And it's one of the things in his later hunger strike that Thomas Ashe was seeking to get. He was looking for prisoner of war status for the Irish Volunteers.
Commandant Ashe.
permission to remove D.I. Smith's body to his wife's home. I told Tom Ashe I wanted to bring home the D.I.'s body, and he agreed and made arrangements for me to do so. I got the D.I.'s body into the car and drove him back to his house outside Navan with it. Mrs. Smith,
Yes?
it's about Harry.
What about Harry?
There was a battle outside the barracks at Ashbourne. He was shot.
Is he dead?
I'm afraid so.
That night, the 5th Battalion were in buoyant mood as they reminisced on what had taken place earlier in the day. The jubilation in the ranks of the Fingal men would not last long, however. Early on Sunday morning, RIC Sergeant O'Reilly of Swords and Head Constable Keeley of Balbriggan arrived with a note of surrender, purportedly signed by Padraig Pearse himself.
I have something here. A message.
That has to be a ploy. We need to verify this. Lads, take those 2 men prisoner.
I was taken in a car to Arbor Hill to meet Pearse. On entering the cell, the sergeant who opened the door shouted at him to get up.
Get up! Commander-in-Chief.
I said I wanted to speak to Mr. Pearse alone. I was told I couldn't. So there we were in the presence of the enemy. I had 3 simple questions for him.
Is this your order, sir?
Yes.
Does it refer to Dublin alone or the whole of Ireland?
Refers to the whole of Ireland.
I asked him if any good would be done by a small band of men who had given a good account of themselves during the week, holding out any longer. He said no.
Gradually, a feeling of utter dejection settled over the camp, and the men barely spoke at all. We just laid about the farmyard, tortured by our thoughts, waiting for news from the city. When Mulcahy arrived back at camp, he quickly dispelled any vague hopes we may have entertained regarding our fate.
I'll restart. I'll let Pearse have to say for himself.
The next morning, I went back to Ashe and gave him the news. Then the trouble was, here was a group of fellows who had killed 8 police in a fight and had wounded an awful lot more. And how are you going to get them to face up to the reality that their only safety was to surrender as a military body under military discipline?
Gather round, men. Your commandant has something to say to you.
Men of the 5th Battalion. It's with a heavy heart that I inform you we must surrender. Even though we've won all our battles, the situation in the city centre is hopeless. Our Commander-in-Chief, Padraig Pearse, has given our orders. So we'll take the orders, we follow the orders as military men. I don't know what's going to happen to us. But know this, you have all fought with bravery and with great courage this week, in the most extreme, difficult circumstances. So each and every one of you hold your heads high. This is only the beginning. Ireland will have its freedom, and I know when Ireland calls, the men of the Fingal Brigade will be there.
Gather up your weapons, men, and leave them here. We'll surrender together as proud Irishmen in military formation.
The 5th Battalion are one of the great successes of the 1916 Rising, but their story is often forgotten because the 1916 Rising is very Dublin-centric. Its focuses on what happens in Dublin. And of course, you do have the destruction of the city centre, which dominates people's imaginations. And then, of course, the execution policy. And many people forget about the fact that it was 160 people tried, but 90 people were said to be executed. It was only with the execution of James Connolly that political pressure was brought to bear on the authorities in Dublin to stop the executions. And that's why Commandant Ashe and De Valera escaped being executed.
All through the week, Ashe had moved erect and purposeful. A leader radiating authority. A comrade pervading his whole small group with a mutual respect, confidence and understanding. From years of work in the Fingal area, shared with men like Frank Lawless, Dr. Dick Hayes, who had shaped the combination, the objective and the will. From the early fostering of the Fianna through much parish activity in education, language, music and games, through to the formation and training of an effective volunteer military force.
With the surrender order now verified by Pearse himself, the Fingal Volunteers were marched to Swords under armed guard. There they were taken to Richmond Barracks in army transport trucks before being sent to various prisons on the British mainland.
I shall always remember that 5-mile march back to Swords after our surrender. And as the column swung around the corner at Colossery, I glanced to my left and by habit saluted the graveyard that overlooks the main road. In front of it stands a monument which marks our family grave, and I wondered if my grandfather and my grandmother, whose bodies lay there, if they would see the cortege pass and recognise in its ranks 2 of their sons and a grandson. They at least would know that we had tried, even if we had failed to achieve.
While the Rising itself had been an utter failure for the Irish Volunteers, the 5th Fingal Battalion could take a huge amount of pride from the sole rebel victory over those fateful 6 days in Easter week, 1916. At a court-martial on the 8th of May 1916, Thomas Ashe was sentenced to death for his role in the Rising. The sentence would be commuted to life imprisonment, with Ashe serving time in Lewes prison in England before being released in June 1917 as part of a general amnesty called by British Prime Minister Lloyd George. Shortly after his release, Thomas Ashe would begin a series of speaking engagements, leading to his rearrest in August 1917. He was convicted on the charge of making a seditious speech and would be sentenced to 2 years hard labour in Mountjoy Prison in Dublin. On September 20th, 1917, Ashe and a number of other Republican prisoners went on hunger strike in protest at the refusal to grant them prisoner of war status. 5 days later, on September 25th, Ashe died at the Mater Hospital after being force-fed by prison authorities. His funeral would be the first time that the reorganised Irish Volunteers would come out in such force since the Rising itself. At it, Michael Collins would make a short and powerful oration at his graveside when he stated, "Nothing additional remains to be said. That volley which we have just heard is the only speech which it is proper to make above the grave of a dead Fenian."